All right, we are live. Welcome from the basements, Ed Bailey and Nick Hudecker.
All
We
right.
are
Hey,
here to
everybody.
talk about some Syslog.
Yeah, first, I got to rant a little bit about
Please tell me.
the usability of enterprise software anymore.
Yes.
You know, you and I both get to play with a lot of different stuff. Well, a lot of stuff I haven't
Mhm.
used in a long time or ever. Um, and I am shocked at how bad these things are to use. Right. And I think it boils down to one thing. The, the people that are building these applications have never been users of these applications, right? And so they have no idea like what good looks like. They don't know like kind of the suffering and pain. They really have no empathy for the people that have to use all this software. And like I go through training programs and stuff, and it's just like, oh, here's a mountain of YAML that you get to learn, or here's a new DSL or domain specific language that you have to understand and master if you want to use my product. That's just absurd to me. Like, even in the database space, like there's proprietary SQL extensions and things like that, but at least there's some kind of common ground in this observability and monitoring stuff. It's a mess. It's incredibly
Yes.
difficult to use anymore.
You could not be more right. It's shocking. I mean, it really is how hard things are to use, unintuitive. And I think you're right. It comes down to the developers, the product managers, the marketing people, everyone. They are not the ideal customer profile, which is kind of weird for me to say that because I'm a long-term Unix person, but I'm learning the marketing lingo. But the people who are the other, there's just a massive mismatch between the vendors and the people who we want to buy our software. It's
Yeah.
just, it is,
It's
it's
amazing to me that
huge.
like the people that have to use this stuff, it's like, why do they put up with it? Like, I know probably because there's really not much of an option.
Low
Um,
expectations.
yeah, that's probably it too. Like really low
Mhm.
expectations. It's just it's upsetting. And I've spent a few days earlier this week, working on some other companies' training programs and stuff. I'm just shocked. I'm like shocked that that's
Yep.
what they want to put out.
It's across the board. That's the standard of hard to use, confusing. Like you want to go look at the documentation, and oh, you need a login to look at the documentation. It's just,
Oh,
I mean,
nothing
I
more
mean,
frustrating than that.
I mean, even when you have the product, so you mean I have to go find that, go to procurement, I have to get the key, I have to get someone to issue me a license just to read about something. It is pointless. It's dumb. It's just defeating.
Yeah. And thinking about like having to learn a vendor's language. It's just the audacity of that. It's like, okay, look, I know you're busy, but here, spend 80 hours learning this, esoteric language that you're going to have to use probably for the rest of your life once you've done
Right.
that product. And the person who learns it, we were talking about this earlier with
Right.
Syslog. We're going to touching this as well. You learn that stuff. Maybe one person learns it or two people. If they leave, you're stuck. Right now, you've got to
Right.
ramp back up on that stuff. You're starting from ground zero, and it's really tragic. It's
It,
I'm
it's
glad we don't
unnecessary.
do that. I'm glad we don't do that stuff at Cribble. Like
And
it's such a
right.
usable product. It anyway. I'm not gonna keep ranting
I,
about it, but I just had to get that off my chest. I've been so aggravated all week about
I think
this.
it's so important, and this is why I like DoorDash. I mean, they're asking everyone who works there to actually do what their frontline employees do.
Yeah.
I think it's important. I think it's important that, and
Enormously
then
controversial, and I get
yeah,
it, but I also, like you've got to understand your customer's pain.
yes,
Um, and that's a really great way, to share that. I'd forgotten about that example, so thanks for reminding me.
yeah,
But yeah, it's just damn,
and
things have got to
and
get better.
the entitlement of the people who are pushing back of like, I don't need to know that. I was like, yes, you need to know that because you're the person who is creating a solution for the person who's customer facing.
Yeah,
I think it's so important, and I see some companies will have their developers rotate through support because they want you to hear what your customers are saying. But most companies don't do that.
they don't.
And I see it so in so many places in IT that we are removed from our customers. We don't understand that we support a healthcare solution. If our healthcare solution is down, people can't get their treatments, they can't get their appointments, and we need to understand that screwing up a change and taking down an application has consequences to real people, and it just it has to be front and center.
Reminds me of a project I worked on at the University of Michigan Hospital System. It was years ago. Um, didn't matter if you were an employee or you were a contractor. Everybody went through, I think, a 2.5 day class Thankfully, it was billable time. Everybody went through a 2.5-day class on customer service. Like, it doesn't matter what job you have in the organization. If you see somebody walking around clueless, like, they could be having literally the worst day of their lives, right? A family member gets brought in an ambulance or something. Like, have empathy for your customer, right? Be able to help them. And I really hope that we can get rid of some, I doubt it, but I hope we can get rid of some of the ego in IT and enterprise software, and like, understand the kind of pain that your customers are going through. So I don't think we need to keep, hammering on that, but
we
man,
certainly could.
Yeah, we absolutely, we could be here for a week ranting about this. But we should all do better, right? I think that's the thing. All right. So with that, you want to talk about Syslog. You've been getting a lot of questions about scaling up your Syslog environments. You're telling me some horror stories about configs that are thousands of lines long, like reads like a medieval epic for pushing data around. So why don't you jump in here and take it away?
Yeah. So it's education. I want to go. So we've done a kind of a high level discussion of Syslog. I want to go into some more detail. Get a lot of questions about this community, and it's a challenge for everyone. It's never going to go away. There's always going to be there, and I just want to go into more details, help our community understand some of the challenges, potential solutions, and how to move forward.
All right.
Syslog is as old as dirt. It's in terms of logging, it is the beginning. You're looking at very basic ways for devices, things on the edge, network devices, security devices to send data to your logging. And so it's super common, but there are challenges that you have to recognize from how you structure it, how you structure it, the formats of the data, how you manage it, what you do with the data, how you load balance. My favorite words, plan for failure, and also differences between UDP and TCP, and then also data that's just not Syslog at all. So there's a lot of things to unpack. So we'll just keep on moving through it.
So just so I'm better informed here, is there an RFC for Syslog, or is it just?
Well, there's actually two.
Okay, that's
helpful.
And
they're detailed. There's what I would call the old, the really really old, and then there's the new. And the new one's a little bit more structured data, and it's guidance. It's a well documented format for vendors to follow. The problem is that some vendors follow it better than others, and you always have to be prepared to understand what exactly your behavior is going to be, and just because when you look at and why it's important. So this includes LogStream, but most of your Syslog servers are going to try to parse your data as if it's RFC compliant Syslog, and if it's not RFC compliant Syslog, you can run into some very unfortunate results, from bad parsing to data that's been dropped, data that's been truncated, and so you always want to take a look at your data and never assume. I've seen too many times where, vendor X, it's Syslog, you point it, all of a sudden you see that it's, XML that's embedded in JSON. I have news for you. That's not Syslog. and so, and I mean, for example, we had one vendor had an API gateway, and it's an enormous slug of UDP Syslog. It was so big that the network was dropping the traffic because it was over 4096 bytes. I mean, we'd see 7,000-8,000 byte packets in UDP, and the network was like, I'm not touching that, and they would just drop it. And so those are the kind of things. And you talk about the mismatch. Our developers are like, well, what do you mean you can't take this data? I was like, it fundamentally will not work. Like, here's the RFC, here's the protocol size. Bring the network team in. And the network team is basically like, fuck off. No, we're not doing this. But it's just, but those are the kind of things that are just, it's such a problem. So you always have to don't make assumptions. Look at your data. You don't want to try to deliver big payloads over UDP, because it's a recipe for losing a lot of data and getting people upset.
Right. If you're not familiar with the difference, UDP is basically fire and forget, right? The data might get there, the packet might get there, it might not, and so you're basically all bets are off when it comes to UDP data.
I have some really bad UDP jokes peppered in these slides.
No, come on.
Oh yeah, I can't help it. I don't know. I mean, yeah. So we'll go through that, the differences between TCP and UDP, because I don't think they're well understood. So people just make some choices.
So question for you though, before you push on to this next one, you mentioned JSON and XML being embedded in there, and that sounds like a horror show. But JSON is kind of like this new standard, right? For not really new anymore. Is there a movement to kind of convert Syslog into a JSON format, or is that just something that some of these tools do anyway?
Well, that's just something that's completely outside of it. Syslog, so the two Syslog RFCs are standard formats just like JSON. It's just that it's just inappropriate to deliver a large JSON payload over UDP first because you're probably not going to have you're probably going to have data delivery problems. But it's so you deliver it over TCP, but don't call it Syslog. It's not a Syslog RFC. So you
Okay.
say I'm gonna deliver JSON over a raw TCP socket. And the reason why is, and so like for example with LogStream has a TCP syslog destination. I'm sorry, TCP syslog source, and it also has a raw TCP source. The TCP syslog source is going to try to parse the JSON as if it's syslog, and it's going to mess it up.
Mhm.
And so if you're pushing JSON over port whatever over TCP, you push it to the raw port and don't call it syslog. Syslog is its own thing.
Got it. Okay, that's good. Good place to start. All
But
right, so we've got our use cases here, right? A lot of firewall monitoring, network devices. Is this also ubiquitous in IoT?
well, and so yeah, so IoT is going to be a little bit different because they're using typically using a different set of protocols. IoT is going to use something like MQTT, which is a lightweight TCP delivery mechanism. That's not syslog either. It's its own thing.
Oh, dang. All
Now,
right.
I think we should probably have another discussion around IoT because I think it's really interesting. It has many of the same challenges, especially around very, very specialized protocols and enormously high volume. We have a customer who's in this, and it's incredible how much data they're taking in every day. And this is just for essentially sensor monitoring. So they want to be able to do things with this data, but it's so much data they just can't retain it. So that creates a whole new, and I think that would be another great webinar topic because I think the IoT use case is just growing. I think about my house. I have, let's see, my last count, I had about 180 devices on my network, which I almost fell out of my chair when I figured out I got 180 devices on my network. It's not that big of a house, but when you start thinking about light bulbs, you start thinking about the every thermostat, all the wireless access points, every just device. It's
It adds
unreal.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even the electric car in my garage, like that's a device on the network at this point.
Right, and then they all talk out, and so, and
Yeah.
I think from a security standpoint, it is. I think it's a coming disaster if it hasn't already been, and just has been figured out because you have too much data coming off of too many consumer devices, that is not exactly secure. Can you imagine that if you want to try to establish security in an IoT use case where you say, okay, we're going to have SSL encryption. How are you going to maintain your SSL certs on my SSL certs on my thermostat that's on my wall? How are you
Yeah.
going to push that and keep that consistent? If it gets
That's the old
compromised,
that's the old
how you
joke,
get it?
right? The
Yeah.
the 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 S in IoT stands for security. And it's not there. So, all right, let's
All
push
right.
ahead here.
All right. So, and wow, we were just talking about something great, and I just totally. All right, it'll come back to me. But but and then also we'll talk about the security in terms of syslog. But and that's what's important, and that's why I get real specific about syslog in that like JSON is its own thing. JSON over TCP is completely appropriate. But you see with vendors, you look at the documentation, they call it syslog. I have news for you, it ain't syslog.
Mhm.
And so it comes up all the time. So firewall monitoring, network device monitoring, open systems logging, storage, appliances, security devices, they all output data. Most, if not most, are going to be in some sort of syslog format. So you have to be able to consume the data cleanly. You don't want to lose it. You want to be able to categorize it. You want to be able to know what it is. You want to be able to get use out of it. So we're talking about some just tips and tricks, things to consider, things to remember about how you're doing this and how to move forward. Challenges: UDP protocol, fire and forget. UDP data, like for a TCP handshake, source and destination see each other. They say, hey, will you take my data? The data comes along. You have a guaranteed delivery, but that creates overhead. UDP, you fire the packet off, whether the endpoint's there or not. Doesn't even bother checking. It's very low overhead, and it's great for high volume data delivery. But there's a downside. That data may never get there, and you'll never know it. And it creates some really fun situations if there's a problem and you're trying to figure that out. Other issues with scaling Syslog, and this is what a lot of people run into, is they try to say, okay, it's all Syslog. We're going to try to shoehorn something that's not Syslog into something that is a Syslog server. Creates a lot of problems. High volume, enormous volumes, firewall devices, IoT use cases, uh, all sorts of things create so much data. I mean, we had a database appliance from IBM one time, this database security appliance. It created so much data, it brought down, it would bring down the local switches in the data center. We're talking 10 gig switches just stopped working. That's how much data was coming through these things. And it's unreal. Also, your modern network architectures, you see a lot of people are moving to the cloud, but they still have these devices that are on-prem that are generating syslog, firewall devices, local, edge networks, different things. They want to fire this UDP data up into their cloud data centers, run into problems because they're now we're trying to shove UDP across networks that aren't particularly necessarily UDP friendly, and also just the distance of delivery. So we'll talk about that. Always remember, not a lick of security in syslog. Now, the TCP syslog, you can add SSL certs, which do work, but typically you're going to start running into some really interesting problems around scale. I've seen too many network devices that once you introduce the overhead of SSL, they start failing. Yep. Alexander from LinkedIn was mentioning with syslog NG. Yep. Yeah, single threaded. So there's all these kind of problems you have to look at in terms of, Alexander, you're exactly right. So you always have to look at these issues about how you do it, how you scale. If you're going to turn on SSL over syslog for a high volume device, will your devices support it? I've seen network devices completely fall over from it.
Yeah,
And
that's a
also
great point. Thanks, Alexander.
painful tool configuration. A lot of your traditionals, your syslog NGs, your rsyslogs, it's painful to manage. Let's kind of roll through this.
All right.
UDP TCP, it's always a balancing act. What I recommend is use by use case. You want to defer to TCP by default. You'll see, for example, someone will set up Tanium. The Tanium logging to Splunk, a lot of times the easiest thing to do is you set up UDP, but then you start looking at delivery issues. And also, Tanium can deliver some very large events, which can also run into some problems. Always use default to TCP, use it wherever you can. But for high volume data sources, I'd highly recommend sticking with UDP. So it's not going to necessarily be possible to have a consistent policy overall, but you got to default to the use case and to the value. Does that
So
make sense, Nick?
let's put a number on that,
Yeah.
right? You said high volume, go with UDP. Give me an example of high volume. What are we talking about here?
I would say anything that's over a few megs per second.
Okay.
So if you're in the hundreds to a few thousands, then stick with TCP. But if you're getting into 5, 10, 20, 100 meg per second, you want to get to UDP because you want to use load balancers, and that's the other problem. When you start jamming a lot of TCP data, and we'll go through this as well. But when you load balancers react differently with high volume TCP. They can't constantly switch, and you don't get an even load. And so the load balancers are going to stick on one node. So when you think you have, say, 5, 8 core servers, and that's going to be enough because you're making an assumption that your data is going to be evenly distributed, but with TCP, that's not going to necessarily be possible. And so UDP is you're going to get a much more even spread, and you're going to get much better scaling and also planning for failure. With TCP and high volume, you're going to get hotspots. You're just one node is just going to get slammed with data, and typically, so you're going to have to scale up instead of scaling out. And then it just creates different HA scenarios, and it can be very awkward. And there you go. I had to put a UDP joke in there. I would tell you a joke about UDP, but you probably wouldn't get it.
There you go. This says from Reddit, but I've heard this joke for decades now, I think.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's why it's the oldest thing out there. I mean, I think what came after punch cards was Syslog.
I actually worked on systems that were the thing that came right after punch card based systems when I was in the military. Yep. So yeah, those things stick around forever, much like Syslog.
Yeah, when I was working at a pretty large university, I moved in the office. This guy had been there forever, and I found punch cards. I was late 20s. I'd never seen a punch card before. And I had to go ask, like, what the hell is this? It was a punch card.
That's where the term patch comes from, right? If you have a hole, you have the wrong hole in your punch card, you put a patch of paper on it. So there's a lot of the same terminology still carries today.
Wow, we have failed. We have failed as a profession. We have really have.
It's important to know your history, right?
Yes, it is. So here's an example of the newest RFC. So 5424. It's well structured. It has good patterns. There's good data there. And so this is an ideal way. If you can conform with this is the way to go. So yeah, I put an example at the top. I put the format at the bottom just so everyone could see it. And let's just look. There's a few things to focus on. Things like the timestamp. There's a timestamp. There's a time zone, and there's also a high precision timestamp. One of the things that makes me just insane with older types of syslog or some of these, that you have just a second. There is more than one event happening in a second. You can't tell where it happened in the second because it doesn't go to the nanoseconds. There's just the ability to read that timestamp is crucial, and
Mhm.
especially everyone wants to know where was my time, where was my event, where did it occur in time. You need the good timestamp in order to understand that. But just be blown away how often there's a problem there.
Yeah. And this also requires a pretty good NTP setup as well.
Yes, and that's another fundamental thing. I
Yeah.
mean, I can't. I mean, I've looked at some data centers, and you start looking at the time, and you find out that the time is set days. I've seen months in the future or in the past, and it's just it just throws everything off.
Yeah.
Another with host name. I can't tell you how many times I've argued with network admins about the importance of having the host name of the device in the event. I really, I have an event that tells me something's broken, but I don't know what's broken because the host name's not in the device. Little things help. Also, I like the event structures are really good in this particular RFC. Like having the key value pairs. I mean, it's a good way to go, but you got to follow it. So I'm going to give some examples there of not so much following it. So this is an example of a prominent security vendor that calls it Syslog, but this isn't Syslog. This is an example of some of the things you run into. They have another format it's Ceph, and they say it's Sys, and it's like no, it's not. That's not Syslog either. And so I mean, this is a good data format, but just don't call it Syslog. I mean,
Yeah. This is a pretty far departure from what we were just looking at.
oh, all right, and those are, but that's the thing when you're vendors and you just choose to not do it. But this is totally manageable with the right tooling, with Splunk, Elastic, Logstash, LogStream, can all handle this. But I just don't call it syslog. That's all. All I'm asking. Call it my favorite format that we made up. We made up out of the air, but just don't call it syslog.
Yeah. Yeah. Let people know what they're getting into.
And this is an example. So this is an R syslog config. Personally the longest one I've had was about 275 lines long. This is the top that came from a 2100 line rsyslog config. So that's 2100 ports that have been exposed off of a single rsyslog server to handle everything and everything. And so in our syslog, for example, there's a whole nother file that goes with this. So you have input and then you have a rule set. So there's a whole nother file for all the rule sets and everything.
Mhm.
So this is painful. Imagine trying to unwind. So we're having a problem with this port and you have to find the port and have to unwind all the different things that go with it. It's painful to manage, it's painful to troubleshoot, and it's painful to add on to.
This goes right into what we're talking about at the top of the live stream, right? Like this is not usable, right? It's survivable, but no one gets up and says, oh, I can't wait to go work on my syslog config, right? This
Yeah,
is a
right.
modern usability disaster.
Right. And those are and especially in these days, we have teams that are struggling to just get by, much less innovate. And hiring engineering time, I just can't say this enough for architects and managers you gotta make things easier for your people. You have to introduce automation, everything you can possibly do to make these processes easier because you're just not adding value to the business by struggling with just bad tools.
That's it
And
right
I mean,
there.
and I like our syslog. I like our syslog NG, but things have to be easier to use at scale because from a time perspective, there's just not enough time to invest to do this. It's just and I've spent too many years fighting with these tools. I mean, it's just
And this is
and
incredibly brittle,
oh,
right? Like
yes,
it's easy to, these are pretty, terse rule set names, for example. And there's frankly, everything in here is coded. It's really easy to, fat finger something and then
And it's
your rules
frightening. I
aren't.
know what all this means because I've looked at this too many times. I've spent
Sure.
years with our syslog, but this I think that goes back to also when you onboard someone new to your team, you don't need to have some grizzly old gray-haired admin who's been doing this forever because more than likely it's going to be some 25-year-old kid who's never seen it before.
Yeah.
And so you need something that's going to be approachable and something that can be understood without having just an inordinate amount of experience.
Yeah.
And it's just important. And I call it this rule of I want things to be understood at 4 a.m. when you've woken me up from it on call. So I just don't have to. I don't have to think about it too much. And so these things just creates stress and overhead where you just want to avoid it if at all possible.
Yeah. All right. So how do we solve these problems?
Well, let's go through some common things. And so this is a very common. So you have your devices all over your network. You have your syslog server right here. So a couple things to remember: UDP syslog, especially, you want your sources as close as possible to your destination. You want your sources and destinations on the same network segment if possible. So ideally, instead of having these network devices log all the way over here, you want to have a syslog server over here, or have some sort of transit VLAN between all of these network devices, so you're avoiding hops. That's gonna minimize your data loss, and so you get your data to something like a LogStream. So LogStream then turns that UDP into TCP in order to relay it to your analytics platform. That's the first law of anything of dealing with UDP is you've got to reduce your hops. You got to reduce how many firewalls you go through. I can't tell you how many times I've seen where all of your UDP data from the firewalls are passing through another set of firewalls in order to get to your syslog servers. And not only does that create enormous overhead for your syslogs for your firewalls, but it creates risk of data loss. And so it's just from an architecture standpoint, you got to simplify, simplify, simplify. Load balancing, this is really big. So I have a diagram. So this is a TCP typical behavior where notice the colors where you're mapping. This is what I mentioned about hotspots. So if my firewall up here on the top is spitting out 100 megs per second, that means I got 100 megs per second sitting on the server and it's not switching, it's not
Mhm.
load balancing. This creates it makes very hard to scale, makes very hard in order to plan for failure. Think about from a plan for failure and scaling standpoint, your only options are typically going to be to scale up. So it means instead of lightweight VMs or EC2 instances, I gotta go even bigger in order to scale. And then I'm going to need to be able to fail over. And so it creates problems because when you do have failure, it's just you're going to lose data. That's just all there is to it. And that's why I recommend change it up in terms of, because this could work just fine for lightweight. The idea is that, especially when I was working with F5s, that with lightweight, so thousands of events, there's going to be bits and spaces where you can have a switching behavior. So it's not a continuous stream of data, but when you have that continuous stream of data, they're just not going to be able to do it. So default to TCP, but use UDP when you go to high volume.
There we go.
So here's a UDP behavior. So you can see you get a clear, nice switching behavior, and you can do really well. So there is preferences I've seen where you want to use maybe IP mount multicast or something like that. The problem you run into with using IP multicast is because you potentially, with load balancers, you can run into issues with data delivery. But the problem is supportability. I've seen some people who are experts in syslog just the old anti-pattern of call it load balancers anti-pattern, and recommend multicasting. But the question is, can you support it? If you can't support it, then I don't recommend doing it, because I'm not going to be on the bridge with you when there's a problem, and there will be. So, but you have to look at you have to look at what your business wants, and typically they're going to want HA, they're going to want scale, and there's going to be a little bit of risk in there as a compromise. You're not going to be able to have the purity of an IP multicast where you have a single IP and you had that sitting on a server, and you potentially are going to have less risk of data loss. I would be willing to have a compromise of a little bit of risk for data loss if I can have better scale and better options for failure. And always, from a load balancer standpoint, pick the strategy that your team can support. If you buy a bunch of F5s and you don't have F5 admins, that's not a good idea. If you can use, so AWS, Azure has some good software load balancers, Nginx is a good one. I've seen a lot of Unix admins have good luck with Nginx.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
pretty
if you're,
ubiquitous at this point.
it really is, and it's great. I mean, F5 owns Nginx. I think it's a great tool. Can't beat it.
Yeah.
But and I've seen a lot of Unix admins do well there. And if you can support IP multicast, that's great too. But always pick. You're going to marry the strategy with what you can support. That's another thing. Coming as a former enterprise architect, don't let some enterprise architect who's not going to support your solution make decisions about things you can't support. It's very important that it's supportable. So let's look at some just basic design considerations. The idea is that multi-data center, multi-routing, we're putting our Syslog relays right here as close as possible to our destinations, and then we're giving us our ability to then clone our data to our network management systems below. The idea is that
now
we
for
have
the Syslog
option.
relays here, you've got Syslog ready. Are you talking about the LogStream icons that are on this diagram?
Yes, using
Okay.
LogStream. Or there could be Syslog NG, it could be our Syslog. Where the idea is that you're going to have that as close to your devices, and then you're going to use it as a relay to your downstream. So basically, convert your UDP to your TCP, and in order to give you that flexibility and scale, plan for failure always. Especially from LogStream's ability, it's very common to have multiple network management systems anymore. To have multiple analytics platforms like a Splunk or Elastic. And also, there's going to be your security devices that may want data too. So it just gives you the ability to supply whatever you need.
All right.
So some closing notes, a couple of things to talk about. And so start with the top. Understand your formats, understand what you have a consistent strategy for how to deal with them. Every time you have a log onboarding, is this syslog? Is it, and then plan accordingly. You can handle non-syslog formats in our syslog and syslog ng, but it's going to take more effort. You want to make sure that you're not losing data. These tools will drop your data in a heartbeat if you're not careful. And so you always want to look and see what's there. Check your timestamps. That's super important. Always be aware. I mean, God love them. Some people like some tools will be in local time. Some will be in UTC, GMT. Always understand what they're outputting, because the time it starts with the timestamp, and stick with it. Load balance your traffic. Plan for failure. Pick the load balancing schemes that your team can support, and then plan accordingly. Especially with TCP versus UDP, highly recommend making a decision that we're going to fault the TCP except where it doesn't make sense in high volume. Do some experimentation with your own hardware to understand that breakpoint. I'd recommend if you're getting above a few thousand messages per second, you strongly want to get into UDP.
Well, all right. So let's touch on that for a second, right? Because if things are going well, right, the world's full of puppy dogs and ice cream, and you've got fairly low volume syslog. Using TCP, no problems. But then the world is no longer full of puppy dogs and ice cream, right? It's full of hurricanes and tornadoes. How do you deal with that, right? Like TCP made sense on Monday, everything went crazy on Tuesday, and now TCP is really burying my network performance because of all the syslog data. Is there a way to switch seamlessly, or is that a major reconfiguration?
Well, and that's what the nice thing is. Typically, the issues aren't going to be in LogStream. It's typically going to be on your load balancers. Yep. So it's going to be with your load balancers. So you have to get your load balancer team involved in order to create a new pool and switch over to your load balancers. So that's typically going to be the long pole in the tent. But that's also why I make some assumptions in terms of what's going to generate data. Now, if it's something that's obviously like your firewalls that's going to generate a ton of data, or Guardian, which is going to generate an ungodly amount of data,
right,
then you're going to set there. But if it's something that's a surprise. I mean, I've seen things with Tanium, for example, where they're to ask a question, and all of a sudden we get 100, 200,000 events in a few minutes. And I'm willing to tolerate that for a little bit, because flooding one system for a few minutes is all right, but it's when it's hours and days when you start to see that drag. And so those are the kind of things that get complicated.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as you mentioned, a lot of times things aren't black and white. There's going to be those shades of gray where you got to use your best judgment. And
well, let's touch on one of the comments that just came in from Turbo Winds, right? It came in from YouTube. It says, all this makes sense. It's a hard sell for the customer, though. They always want load balancing for HA, and they want TCP for reliability, and they also want TCP for high volume. So if you're in his shoes, his or her shoes, and they're like, you know what, I'm getting all this pressure from the business, I'm just going to go with TCP because they think that's what they want. How do you talk them down from that kind of requirement? They may not understand it. They may just think that like HA is better, TCP is better. I don't want to lose a drop of data.
Right.
So let's role play that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times you have to have an economic conversation of if you're requiring 100% of data delivery and you can't drop any data, then you're going to have to set up specialized load balancer pools. You're going to have very large servers. So instead of 8 or 12 core EC2 instances, you're going to have to go to 32 core instances. You're going to have dedicated load balancers to handle this data. And I think you're going to have a lot more expense for this
Yeah,
type
but if
of
it's
data.
not my budget, right? Like,
Right.
like I'm coming to you and I'm saying, you know what, man, I can't lose anything, whether it's a security use case or whatever. It's not my budget. I don't care. Go do it. Go make it happen. Right. That seems like it's a higher level conversation that you need to be having rather than, what size of EC2 instance you might be running.
Yeah, I mean that's true, and that's typically where when I've had those conversations from a planning standpoint, I start talking about the complexity, the time it's going to take to support this, and you put together a proposal. So here's an A proposal for 100%. Here's a B proposal for 98.9%, and have a comparison of how much are we willing to spend and how much effort are we willing to spend in order to support this requirement. Does this expense match up with the business priority? And then go from there, because I mean, I understand the ideal, but TCP for high volume just creates so many problems.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a fair amount of education that has to happen as well, right? Like what is this data really? What are we really going to do with it?
Right.
Does it make sense to outlay all this cash and sacrifice all this budget for something we may never touch again in all
Right.
likelihood?
That's a good point. You have to always look at the value of the data. Is this data meaningful? Also, the idea that, okay, we're going to put LogStream locally inside, just say for an MSP use case, we're going to put LogStream inside your data center so we get our destinations as close as possible to the data source in order to get that higher availability that you're looking for. I mean, for example, I've seen more than a few MSPs and SaaS providers who want to see an UDP syslog over the internet, which I ludicrous, but I see it all the time. And so those are the kind of things that you have to really take a look at and take the time to have those discussions. And I think, as you said, start with the value of the data. What's the business priority for this data? Is the business priority for this data going to match up the expense in order to maintain this SLA? Because it's just not easy. TurboWinds, does that make sense to you?
Yeah,
if you want
to talk about this some more, join the community on Slack. We're happy to continue this conversation there. Hopefully that helps.
Also, Twitter. So my handle is eBailey at 1367. Nick, what's yours?
N Hudecker, NHEUD as in David, ECKER. Pretty easy to find.
Yeah, and anytime. And those are the kind of things that are just it's just not easy. And then these are the kind of discussions I think you have to talk with the business priority, data. Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? When you get down to it, I mean, so much of the data may not be valuable, and that's where you have to start looking at. You have to match up the requirements. It's easy for a leader to say, I want to keep all my 30 terabytes of data, but then you look at the cost, and you're going to have those questions because it's just the costs add up.
Yeah.
I mean,
all right, we've been going for about 40 minutes. Ed, why don't you wrap us up?
All right. Hey, logging's fun. It's a great way to have a career.
This is turning into like a what I did on my summer vacation kind of
exactly.
pitch.
Syslog's never going away. So it's important to understand the impact, understand what you're doing. Look at have some rules. Look at the things we've talked about of standards versus TCP and UDP, understanding what they mean, and then adopting quality tools like Cribble LogStream as a way to help you manage your data, reduce your effort, and make your life easier.
All right, perfect. If you want to continue the conversation, Ed mentioned you can reach out to either of us on Twitter. You can join the Cribble community. If you want to, I was just going to say this. If you want to try out LogStream and start to run some of your syslog data through it, Go to sandbox.cribble.io for a nice walkthrough tutorial. And then there's cribble.cloud if you want to get a free 1 terabyte a day to really start processing some data. And so with that, Ed, over to you, man.
Hey, it was great. Enjoy the conversation as always. Thank you for the questions. Please let us know. We're here to talk. We're here to help. So please let us know what we can do.
All right, right on time. I got my leaf blowers outside, so it's ready to wrap up.
There you go.
Right.
Thanks,
Thanks
Nick.
a lot. Bye.
Take care.